is organized this time around a theme of international law as an instrument. As has become our tradition, our opening plenary is this Grotius lecture, which is sponsored by American University's Washington College of Law. Indeed, this is the 21st Grotius lecture, reflecting a deep and abiding partnership between Ecole and the Washington College of Law, one that we hope will continue for at least another 21 years. Here on the stage with me are our distinguished guests, Professor Martti Koskenniemi, Professor Ann Orford, and Dean Camille Nelson, who will preside as moderator. Before turning the program over to her, allow me a brief introduction of Dean Nelson. Since 2016, she's been the Dean of the American University Washington College of Law. She previously served as the Dean of Suffolk University's School of Law and as a professor at Hofstra Law School and St. Louis University School of Law. Dean Nelson is an expert on the intersection of critical race theory and cultural studies, with a particular emphasis on criminal law and procedure, health law, and comparative law. She's received many awards, of which I'll just mention one. In 2013, Dean Nelson was honored as one of the top women of law by the influential Lawyers Weekly. Dean Nelson, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, President Murphy, for that kind introduction. Thank you for your leadership of the American Society of International Law and for the historic role that you and your colleagues have played in elevating the scholarly discussion of international law, both from a theoretical and practical perspective. It is my privilege to share the stage with our two distinguished international legal scholars, Professor Martti Koskenniemi and Ann Orford. It is also a tremendous honor to be among so many judges, lawyers, scholars, advocates, law school administrators, and of course, I do believe we have a number of our wonderful students here as well. My warm welcome to all of you. Today, as President Murphy mentioned, marks the 21st year that American University Washington College of Law has proudly participated as sponsor of the Grotius Lecture. It is the largest gathering of international lawyers, policymakers, and practitioners in the United States. This lecture also serves as the opening of the annual meeting of Ecole. We value this important partnership and our collective commitment to the advancement of international relations on the basis of law and justice, especially as we consider the global challenges faced by humanity today. Before introducing our distinguished lecturer, I want to specifically thank Mr. Hal Shapiro, who is an adjunct faculty member at the Washington College of Law and a partner at Aiken Gump, for his commitment, Hal, and for your generosity in supporting the Grotius reception. I also want to thank our International and Comparative Legal Studies program. It is with great thanks that I acknowledge the work of Director Patade Elai, who is in the front here, and her entire staff, many of whom are with us this evening. All of them have worked tirelessly and closely with the American Society of International Law in creating such an engaging and provocative venue for the annual meeting's focus on the distinctive ways international law serves as an instrument that national and international actors involve and deploy, and by which they are sometimes constrained as well, as you know better than I. This year's Grotius lecture entitled Enchanted by Tools, ? International Law and Enlightenment, will be delivered by Professor Martti Koskenniemi. And I want to apologize because it will probably be the case that every time I pronounce his name, it's different. So Martti, has already been very generous to me in explaining the proper pronunciation, and I fear I'm doing his incredible lecture to me and guidance a great disservice. But he is a distinguished professor of law at the University of Helsinki and director of the Eric Castrain Institute of International Law and Human Rights. He is a member of the Institut de Droit International, a fellow of the British Academy, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Previously, he served as a member of the Finnish Diplomatic Service and the International Law Commission. Professor Koskenniemi is also uniquely known in the international legal community for his tremendous work in redefining the modern international law and its structural analysis. His main publications include From Apology to Utopia, The Structure of International Legal Argument, The Gentle Civilizer of Nations, The Rise and Fall of International Law, and The Politics of International Law. He is currently working on a history of international legal thought from the late medieval period to the 19th century. Please do join me in welcoming him to the podium. Thank you.
Oh, you did well. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Dean Nelson. Thank you also, Paddy Alai, for the invitation, Sean Murphy. It's a pleasure to be here. So the theme of this year's meeting is international law as an instrument, a tool. And the theme of my talk is a question, enchanted by the tools. That refers back to a very rational idea, an Enlightenment idea. And it raises the question, if international law is a tool, what is it a tool for? At home, we think of law as an instrument of self-government. It represents the nation's law-creating will, and it's a standard to scrutinize the actions of public authorities. It's always been difficult to transpose this view onto the international level. Whose will is represented by international law? Which authorities does it bind? In this country, we have frequently heard that the US government expresses the will of its people. To be bound by international law would be strictly undemocratic. It is sometimes said that international law is an instrument of the international community. That was always hard to defend. What is the international community? How do you know what it wants? There's a respectable literature on the theme. Textbooks still today rehearse literature from Austin to Kelsen, from Jelinek to Hart, Lauterbach to McDougall, naturalism, rational choice, functionalism, legal process. All that seems hopelessly passé. Instead of reviewing that theory, I will assume that nobody believes in international law because we believe in such theories. We yield to it because it's there, because what else is there? There's a famous quote from the 16th century lawyer Michel de Montaigne. I read it in English. Now the laws maintain their credit, not because they are just, but because they are laws. This is the mystical basis of their authority. They have no other. Montaigne made this point at a time of religious war to persuade Frenchmen not to look for fundamental explanations. Shut up and obey. Eventually, France would emerge as a peaceful and a reasonably prosperous country. We have learned to call this positivism and be critical about it. For although it helped to end the bloodshed, it also founded royal absolutism, at which point it began again to seem useful to look for an explanation. There's long been a Montaigne moment in international law. We do not look for explanation, but yield nevertheless because of its enchanting power. During the Cold War, that may have seemed understandable. The world was a dangerous place. Let's not rock the boat. But the enchantment persisted. In the late 80s and early 90s, I took part in many United Nations General Assembly sessions, as you know, from mid-September to Christmas. Flying back to Helsinki with the delegation, with a tired delegation, someone would inevitably exclaim, "Oh, what tough time we had, and isn't it hard to think whether anything useful was achieved?" And then in a hesitant voice, "But isn't it anyway better that we have the UN than that we don't have it?" This was the voice of ideology, enchantment. How do you know? So this is what I mean by enchanted by the tools, the readiness to work in and support international law independently of a clear view of what it does or what its ends are, out of a sense that, well, somehow we can't just live without it. I think this enchantment is breaking up. Global governance no longer feels so inevitably. Do I need to mention Brexit, American disengagement, the ICC, the INF, WTO, the climate change treaty, disenchantment with human rights regimes? You know what I'm talking about. Disenchantment is not necessarily a bad thing. There's a crack in the mirror, and that's how the light gets in, Leonard Cohen puts it. First, some faith is lost, then shown not only as mistaken, but the very source of our troubles. Then replaced by a sharper awareness. And the awareness brings enlightenment and the ability to change oneself and the world. That's one theory. But then there's another kind of disenchantment. A faith is lost and replaced by nothing. But the mind abhors a vacuum, so nothingness becomes cynicism. Because nothing can be trusted, I can believe whatever I want. Whatever I do, I can do because I can. Disenchantment as a path to enlightenment and a path to cynicism. How to distinguish will be the subject of my talk tonight. I will begin by a sketch of the way we were enchanted by global governance in the 1990s. I will then move to discuss how the enchantment wore off with respect to two of its key aspects, expert knowledge and human rights. In the final section, I will take up the question of how to respond to disenchantment and to say something about history, education, and utopia. So first, enchantment. International law used to have a reasonably clear objective. The first generation of international lawyers at the end of the 19th century created it to spread liberal legislation in Europe and to civilize the colonies. For them, international law represented, in the words of the Statute of the Institut de Droit International, the juridical consciousness of the civilized world. Now, the idea of civilization did not survive the First World War. Interwar lawyers instead fixated on the idea of social progress. International too would develop like the domestic state with modern economy and technology into a society, an international society. After the Second World War, this expectation was downplayed. Cold War politics made it subscribe to the extreme formality of sovereign equality. Decolonization would strengthen that view. The telos of international law would be to let all nations bloom, coordinate their actions, and settle their disputes. But then something happened in the 1960s. Many of you remember. In 1964, Wolfgang Friedman recorded the rise of a new law of cooperation, His book, The Changing Structures of International Law, spoke of technological progress, environment, trade, development. I quote from that book. The national state and its symbol, national sovereignty, are becoming increasingly inadequate to meet the needs of our time. The European community, he wrote, was a possible precursor of future integration of mankind. Unquote. Alongside traditional values, national, religious, agrarian, bourgeois, there would be plurality and there would be individualism. Let me quote Wolfgang Friedman again. The necessity to protect the individual as such internationally, even against his own state, has become an accepted postulate of international lawyers and the recurrent subject of international debate. 1964. Now flash forward to the 1990s. People were all of a sudden saying things such as, well, now the UN security is finally working as it should. A global free trade regime, trials of political leaders for crimes against humanity, human rights bodies like mushrooms after the autumn rain. Something had happened. Remember still the UN World Conferences. Rio 1992, Vienna 1993, Cairo 1994, Copenhagen 1995, Beijing equally in 1995, Istanbul 1996. Environment, human rights, women, social development, housing. All this hurly-burly underpinned by a new vocabulary of globalization, even constitutionalization, and of course, New World Order. In 1998, the very year he was elected president of this society, Tom Frank published his Fairness in International Law and Institutions to analyze what he saw around himself. With expanding global law, formal rules would no longer do. They would yield to the fair management of global problems. The surface may have seemed technical, but Tom knew better. In another emblematic work, he celebrated, and I quote from him, the emerging triumph of individualism, unquote, that laid, according to him, and I quote again, the foundations of universal constitutional democracy. Universal constitutional democracy. President of the American Society of International Law, 1998. My mentor, Tom Frank. Nobody expressed this enchantment better than Tom. International law itself as the symbol of fairness and rights. The General Assembly declared the 1990s as the decade of international law, and 2 years later, Kofi Annan wrote of a Grotian moment in the international world. Disenchantment. What irritates critics today to no end is that global power doesn't present itself as conventional politics at all, but as knowledge. Experts rule because they know that climate change is true, that increasing prison sentences have no effect on criminality, and that the first to suffer from Brexit are its supporters. On the one side, truth, on the other, ignorance. Only surrender is available to that other side. But as experts know very well, opinion exists on both ends. Positivism died long ago, replaced by all the fuzzy science that tells us that facts actually appear in regimes of knowledge, which may be true in their own terms, but are no longer that solid when we compare such regimes or look deep inside them. Austerity is a choice, not a necessity. Global law is about complexity. Environment, trade, investment, development, security. Each regime is about knowledge, yes, but also about value, about a specific project. The trade expert wants more trade, and the environmental scientist more protection. The Interior Ministry wants more surveillance, the Justice Ministry wants less. Oh, it's also predictable. The impression with the outsider is that the certainty that each side claims is a sham. What is actually happening, is a struggle over resources and prestige, power. No doubt the experts consult and coordinate, but outsiders will have no role in those debates. They have none of those tools. Instead, they have one recollection, namely that whatever the debate, we are treated as an ignorant underclass. Whatever the result, we lose. Well, you might think, should not the government make such choices? But modern government is just a local version of an international negotiation. The environment minister operates an environmental policy that's utterly global. The trade ministry, a kind of local bureau of the WTO. And the justice minister will keep reminding everyone of their human rights obligations. Domestic departments work on systems of knowledge that have nothing domestic about them. Of course, because their personnel were once Erasmus students in Europe and now travel to Brussels, Washington, Beijing. All governance is global governance. But the tools of governance are not as powerful as we think. I used to sit in public debates on the draft treaty on the transatlantic trade and investment, the TTIP, and its follow-up, the EU-Canada CETA initiative. In those debates, people often wanted to know whether private-public arbitration might enhance investment, whether, in other words, it made economic sense for a state to accept to be sued in such arbitration. There were always two economists in those panel discussions. One claimed that such clauses invariably attract investors. According to the other, they made no difference whatsoever. Then the two economists began to attack their respective models. The feeling of disbelief and frustration in the audience was tangible. Must we really take a stand on the relative merits of economic models in order to decide whether to support investment agreements or not? Of course they would not. We would not. And of course, economic tools do not work like that. To quote the Harvard economist Danny Roderick, the correct answer to almost any question is, it depends. Different models, each equally respectable, provide different answers. Now, many concluded that there really was no difference between expert knowledge and opinion, truth and bias. You can always find an economist or a lawyer to defend whatever. What the expert says is just cynically dressed as knowledge so as to exclude me. The media loves experts. It gives us 35 seconds to give our view on the state of the economy or the ways to solve the Syrian crisis. And we yield against our better judgment. For as experts, we know the complexity of our tools and feel the uncertainty. But we cannot show that in public, even as we privately talk about it all the time. There are two kinds of expert knowledge. Knowledge of the day and knowledge of the evening. Imagine an interdisciplinary conference. During the day, performances full of self-confidence, like this one. Here is what I know, the latest datum from my research. Impressive, powerful, self-assured. But then at night, after the conference dinner, you hear a private conversation. Oh, my field is in crisis. You cannot imagine how divided we are about the fundamentals, and especially about the fundamentals. While we may agree on some things on the surface, we really have no idea where it came from and how to explain it. Daytime confidence, uncertainty at night. Audiences have seen this. Experts constantly contradict each other, make mistakes, no accountability. So they have concluded that these are just people in bad faith. According to a study by Pew Research here in the United States from last July, 58% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents say that colleges and universities have a negative effect on the way things are going on in this country. 58%. Disenchantment as a way to cynicism. In the 1950s, Karl Polanyi observed that the internationalization of economic decisions had, in his words, separated the people from power over their own economic life and opened the door for fascism. As the philosopher Didier Eribon has shown more recently, the distance between the city, in his case Paris, and the countryside, Reims, has become a breeding ground for resentment and reaction. Eribon remembers how his father and his father's friends, all of them communists, used to struggle for improved conditions in the factory, expressing solidarity with guest workers from Turkey. Now the factory is gone, so is solidarity. Farming hardly pays off, and the young have moved. Everyone votes for Marine Le Pen. It's really hard to be enchanted a lot of the new international law because it's so obviously partisan. I recently, just a few weeks ago, took part in a discussion about the international law of ICT, information and communication technology. On the one hand, there was the 500-page Tallinn manual, a set of extremely detailed rules underlined by only one consideration: to lower the threshold for using force. No surprise, because it was prepared by Western experts in military law. On the other hand, there's a Russian-Chinese draft in the United Nations General Assembly on an international code of conduct. That code of conduct seeks to curb, and I quote from it, the dissemination of information that incites to terrorism, separatism, and extremism. Code words to censor critiques of Russian and Chinese leadership. International law is a blunt tool. The relevant question often is not what does it say, but whom does it empower? From one new multilateral treaty to another, law's knowledge is a knowledge of what it calls and what Tom called fairness. And then it leaves it to the experts to figure out what, if anything, that could mean. I disagree with the Liberal Academy when it presents the backlash as being about the decay of truth, in the words of a recent report by the Rand Corporation. Nobody can meet the standard that this critique presumes. If you ask a scientist if the Higgs boson is true, you will hear that, of course, it cannot be 100% proven. The scientist will also tell you that in such matters, there is no certainty. The same evidence on GMOs, hormone beef, and glyphosate is interpreted in wildly different ways in respectable American and European research institutions. There is no truth about what is a safe product. So I suggest that the expert knowledge that came with global law is not at all as clear and uncontroversial as it presents itself. It comes in regimes that are actually political agendas, contradictory and uncertain. To be enchanted by them is to be taken for a ride. Like many others, I used to think that this problem, the problem of hidden agendas of instrumental knowledge, was to be resolved by politics. Let's politicize it. Now I'm no longer so sure. There is no pristine, authentic field of politics, uncontaminated by what we know. Disenchantment has also struck politics, especially in the way that it has been colonized by human rights. Disenchantment number 2, politics. Friedman was still careful in 1964 to suggest that human rights had not yet advanced that far globally. So he only made a satisfied note of certain regional developments. Shift again to the 1990s, and Tom Frank wrote, and I quote, "Each individual is entitled to choose an identity reflecting personal preference. In composing that identity, each may select more than one allegiance," unquote. Characteristically optimistic. Society had no claim to enforce morals. Rights had put a limit to the discretion of public officials, overriding their utilitarian calculations and policies. This explains the original enchantment we had in rights. What could be greater than to have a preference that would override every other preference? As more and more preferences were translated into rights, however, activists began to worry. If everything is a right, then nothing is. Well, how do you separate genuine from fake rights? Natural law once helped us to do that, but that's hardly available now. Some of the expansion of rights talk was, of course, genuinely helpful, but one could see where this was going. Did racists and misogynists have the right of free speech? Was there a right to bear arms in public places? What about the religious fundamentalists' preference to educate their children at home or refuse vaccination? Or the right to security? Would it be a good human rights measure to increase the presence of CCTV cameras in public localities? No good human rights lawyer would ever think that. They would immediately retort that, no, such policies are not part of genuine human rights. And again, many would be outraged. So you say that everyone's rights are of equal concern, but in your practice, you always override ours. Hypocrites. Economic, social, and cultural rights seem important to show that human rights have a heart, that they are not blind to larger social problems. As such, however, we hear that they have only a programmatic character. So are they not a kind of party program? A social democratic policy of the welfare state, only cleverly disguising itself as something non-political to bind the hands of the finance minister? Philip Alston's recent work as UN Special Rapporteur on the relation of privatization to extreme poverty is excellent human rights policy. But it's also economic policy, and the question is whether it has any distance to sophisticated socialist attention to capitalism's dark side. And if there is no difference, well, what then about the claims on universal, inalienable? For those not already enchanted, rights can only appear as a leftist policy in unpolitical disguise. Everyone believes that extreme poverty ought to be eradicated. Many who think this also believe that this can be best accomplished by deregulation. Trade union, these people might say, have distorted the labor market, undermining incentives for companies to hire workers and thus contributing to unemployment. The rights camp tends to forget that the most important rights struggles from the Magna Carta to the present have been about taxation and property. If John Locke is a part of the human rights canon, as Hersch Lauterpacht, among others, believed, then protection of property is not only part of the canon, but its central piece. Friedrich Hayek was also a rights activist. He wanted to end oppressive planning and to liberate the energies of entrepreneurs, and kicked off the development of international trade law. When rights advocates speak of corporate social responsibility, business executives respond that companies contribute best to welfare rights by filling the expectations of their customers and the pockets of their owners. nor is this necessarily wrong. It may only seem so if one's bias is of the social democratic kind. The rights activist may feel that the corporate executive is not taking rights seriously, but the corporate executive will inevitably view the rights advocate as a closet communist. There's a paradox about rights. They depend on the kind of expert knowledge that they were created to limit. By themselves, you see, rights are just generally expressed preferences. To give content and make reality of them, knowledge and empirical causalities are needed. Knowledge on security and education, knowledge on health and housing, knowledge on environment and agriculture. All areas where governance takes place. But learning expert knowledge is also to learn the complexities and uncertainties that experts feel. It undermines the sure intuition that rights provide. The paradox is that the best human rights policies might not be human rights policies at all, but the best economic policies, the best development policies, the best agricultural policies, and so on. Human rights is a 1960s inheritance. The breakup of homogeneous national cultures, the loosening of social religious norms, the rise of a commercially incentivized non-conformism. By the 1990s, rights had utterly undermined old-style politics and did this two ways. Rights had set limits to public authorities' powers. Constraining the state seemed indeed the very point of rights. And rights defined political objectives in abstract and universal terms with no connection to domestic histories or practices. But the enchantment was broken when social democrats, panicking over declining electoral support, co-opted rights as part of the third way. Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Gerhard Schröder rose to power by supporting human rights and international agendas of intervention and the environment. But they also co-opted the third way. That co-opted broke the enchantment, eventually bringing social democracy down and threatening to take human rights with it. By the time of the financial crisis of 2008, rights had become wholly infected by their association with a centrist elite that presided over unending austerity and massive growth of domestic and international inequality, at the same time preaching human rights. An increasingly cynical electorate was now looking for revenge in iconoclastic attacks on political correctness and a reactionary attachment to a pre-1960s nationalist nostalgia. I turn now to disenchantment today, when disenchantment has struck the tools of knowledge and the tools of our politics. No doubt, law has always been a tool for something. Hugo Grotius advocated this as an instrument of sociability, or as he put it, the design of society is that everyone should quietly enjoy his own with the united force of the whole community, unquote. The Dutch Golden Age was an age of pious religiosity and the scrupulous respect of property. A century later, that very enchantment had become the problem. As Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote, Grotius would always, and I quote from the English translation of Du Contrat Social, Grotius would always offer facts as proof of right. It is possible to imagine a more logical method, but not one more favorable to tyrants, unquote. So enchanted was Grotius by legalism that he saw no problem in consenting to slavery. Rousseau was scandalized. The point was not that humans were able to be sociable, to follow rules, but their ability to enact those rules and do that as participants in a collective will, the condensed wisdom of the nation that could do no wrong. A century later, liberal jurists were seeking to temper nationalism, and especially the clashing nationalisms of France and Germany, by reference to civilization and liberty. They spoke of l'esprit d'internationalité, followed in the 20th century by lawyers advocating social progress and development through law. Consecutive circles of enchantment and disenchantment, from Christian piety to civilization, from civilization to social progress, and global law. But where to? What was global law for? Sovereignty or intervention? Austerity or welfare? Freedom of trade or fair trade? Security or privacy? Use or protection of natural resources? Kosovo or Crimea? Walls or bridges? It was about all of these things and many other things. Which leads me back to my title, Enchanted by the Tools. Never has law played a more visible role in international life than in the long 1990s. When confronted with a problem, the first thing we have been learned to ask is this constitutional? If there is violence, we want to know whether Chapter 7 has been used. If a political crisis arises, we worry about basic human rights. Have crimes against humanity been committed? Have courts been appropriately seized? And what about the standards of due process? It's very common to talk about the judicialization of international relations, the image of the judge as the paradigm for good policy, and the other way around, multilateral diplomacy as a legal system. The law itself became the true object of our enchantment. And although it was only theorized as a modest tool, it was hard to say what it was a tool for. Well, other than adjusting the interests and priorities that were powerful enough to compete for influence at international institutions. All we wanted to know is whether the rule of law was obeyed. In those earlier moments, law pointed to some more or less clearly defined objective, the pious life of the Dutch Golden Era, national revolution in France, civilizing the world from Belgium, social progress. Those ideas, of course, were not clear nor homogeneous, but they gave a standard and a vocabulary against which it was expected that the moment and the moment's law would be measured. Global law communicates nothing beyond the very techniques and institutions and rights of which it itself consists. Like the state, globalization has become an arbitration process, a system of allocating power, balancing interests, solving conflicts. There is no serious utopia, just the laws, autonomous and autistic. Many people benefited, but not all did. Some of those who didn't believed that all this was merely to perpetuate the privileges of a new elite and leave the rest with bullshit jobs and values at the bottom of the new cultural hierarchies. Today's backlasher doesn't feel left behind. He wants no part, no place in that train. He or she feels defeated. Hence, they have no interest in coming along, even less debating reform. Reform is the very life of global law. Exit is the ruling strategy. Exit the EU, exit Human Rights Council, exit the Climate Change Treaty, exit the Iran Agreement, exit the INF Treaty, exit Schengen, exit the Council of Europe. Global governance law offered nothing apart of more of the same. The resulting disenchantment bred two kinds of cynicism. The cynicism of the insiders was that of no alternative. One just had to press on. Pragmatism transactionalism, the endless reform that never asks the question, what is the institution form in the reform of which we are engaging? The insider knows that their truths emerge from choice and value, but suppress that knowledge because they have no idea how to debate those. I know God is dead, but I continue worship. The outside cynic thinks that the plurality and uncertainty of global knowledge that is so obvious actually means there is no measure at all, and never was. The only thing that's certain is that it's all a conspiracy to uphold the privileges of the global people. And so I don't need to engage. Indeed, engagement would be to give legitimacy to something that doesn't deserve it. The institution and the people in it are the enemy. Disenchantment has made cynics both of insiders and of outsiders. One simulates enchantment, the other seeks an alternative enchantment in the privileges of an imagined past. Hypocrisy and reaction. What alternatives are there? Should one try to find a new moral project as the telos of the law, a kind of new naturalism to ground the practice? But faith in a moral project is not born out of the hope one had it. Philosophy and jurisprudence are in no shape to solve international law's problems. Perhaps the first thing to acknowledge is that these are our tools. Even if we are a little disenchanted, they are still good for some things, although not perhaps for other things. Disenchantment makes it possible to think strategically. The way international law comes with typical institutions of certain formalism, lawyers, high costs. It binds you to a whole world of standards and precedent that will come to haunt you in due course. The drafters of the WTO treaties believed they could have just a little bit of law. And they ended up with a legal Frankenstein. Law now benefits some against others. In a recent essay by Werner Tenkate and Sarah Nowen, they showed how the choice of exercising jurisdiction by the International Criminal Court in the Ugandan situation supported the Ugandan executive against the views of the country's parliament, supported the internationalists against the others in Uganda. Fragmentation highlights how different legal tools prioritize different values, different audiences, whether to choose this way or that. As Adam Smith usefully reminds us, and I quote from this enlightener, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, law is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all, unquote Adam Smith. But I do not want to suggest that a better strategic thinking is the only outcome, or indeed the most important outcome of disenchantment. On the contrary, strategic thinking is quite compatible with cynicism. So I want to end instead by pointing to 3 avenues for disenchanted minds that might help us to think about international law in an enlightened way. I want to say something about history, education, and utopia. History. Disenchantment with Roman law in the 16th century opened a way for a new, ambitious, and revolutionary legal science in France that, instead of rehearsing the old glosses, looked deep in the nation's history, the Gauls and the Franks, the ancient constitution. The point is not whether the result was historically true. The point is that what transpired was an idea of France as a joint project to unite a group of people, present and future generations. There is much new history in our field. History of war, human rights, humanitarianism, League of Nations, and so on. A student once asked me, does the historization of something mean that that something is dead? Well, I don't think so. But it does suggest disenchantment, a doubt, a need to understand how did we get here in the first place? Pious Christians in the 1830s opposed historical studies of Jesus because they thought this would undermine religion. But Christianity did not die with the sensational publication of David Strauss's Das Leben Jesu in 1835. Instead, historical studies of the Bible became a respected part of the theological curriculum, better prepared to respond to problems of faith early modern Europeans were experiencing. The best new histories do two valuable things. They provide intimate narratives of the ways in which legal imagination responds to the world, the wisdom and stupidity with which governance takes place. And as Anne Orford has reminded us, it makes it possible to see how power operates in time, linking generations together in hierarchical patterns that persist and persist and persist. Philip Allott once noted that law brings society's past to its present, but also looks at the present from its desired future. As usual, it's hard to express a really important point better than Philip does. My second point, education. How lawyers think is a function of how they are trained. It is striking that in Enlightenment France, legal education at universities had no intellectual content at all. The Salons despised the Ecole de Droit as the last vestige of the old regime. At the same time, thick volumes of natural law were being produced at German universities, ridiculed by Voltaire, but producing some of the most enlightened, some of the most radical ideas of law ever produced. I take my cue from one of them. The Transcendental reduction propounded by Immanuel Kant suggests, and I agree, that understanding law is not about what might be a valid legal rule or a valid interpretation of a rule. You see, law is a human enterprise. Therefore, it has no ontological center. Students ought not to ask what the law is. Instead, they should inquire, what should one think in order to believe that this or that is valid law or valid interpretation? This leads inquiry away from law as existing in its own right, with a stable center, coherent structure, worthy of it being enchanted as itself, to law as part of a larger ideological and political world. What is it that makes some legal performances persuasive to some audiences and not to others? A disenchanted response to the question, what does the law say, is to ask, who wants to know and for what purpose? My last point, utopia. Enlightenment is not strong on utopia. It knows how to attack myth, but then has a tendency to be enchanted by the tools with which it does this. In 1713, the Abbé de Saint-Pierre published the first version of his plan for perpetual peace. This was based on a critique of the irrationalism of the absolutism of Louis XIV. Saint-Pierre had been an official in the court itself. As he saw it, if the kings only knew their interests, they would immediately conclude a peaceful union to arbitrate their disputes and help each other to suppress domestic rebellion. How to go about this, Saint-Pierre proposed, would be the task of what he called science politique. A few years thereafter, Rousseau noted that nothing had come or could come from such a plan. Kings were not the kind of rational interest maximizers, it supposed. The very system of statehood drove them to compete for glory and greatness. The good Abbé had been enchanted by the tools of reason and science, but those were unable to carry out the task they were assigned to do. No myth has enchanted modern lawyers more than the Promethean view of humans using reason to instrumentalize nature for their purposes. It's time to let go of that myth. Karl Marx, another Enlightenment hero, was onto something when he wrote that human beings are species beings. But he didn't go far enough to remove the barrier between the human species and other species, and indeed the world of nature itself. So I suggest, like Rousseau in his critique of Saint-Pierre, that no worthwhile utopia can come out of reliance on instrumental reason, thinking of the world as something outside ourselves, as an object to fit our wants. Instead, we should adopt the species perspective. Now, how to do this? This is both very difficult and very easy. How so? Leaving Helsinki to teach my course at NYU last year, I asked my daughter Aino if she would like to accompany me like many years ago when she was a small girl. She looked at me a little sadly and said, "Dad, I think our family's carbon footprint is already large enough." Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Koskenniemi. Thank you very much. Thank you for your thought-provoking remarks. They will undoubtedly lead to further discussion, analysis, and action. We are also fortunate to be joined by Professor Anne Orford, our discussant for this critical lecture. Professor Orford is a visiting professor of law and John Henry Gregory Lecturer on World Organization at Harvard Law School. She is the Redmond Berry Distinguished Professor, Michael D. Kirby Chair of International Law, and an Australian Laureate Fellow at Melbourne Law School, where she directs the Laureate Program in International Law. She is an elected Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and a past President of the Australian and New Zealand Society of International Law. Her scholarly works include International Authority and the Responsibility to Protect, Reading Humanitarian Intervention, Human Rights and the Use of Force in International Law, and the edited collection International Law and Its Others. As well, she is the author of the Oxford Handbook and the Theory of International Law collection. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
It's a great privilege to have been invited to discuss Professor Martti Koskenniemi's Grotius lecture and to take part in this meeting of the American Society of International Law. Professor Koskenniemi, as you've heard, is widely recognised as one of the most distinguished scholars, practitioners and teachers of international law in our time, and he has been and continues to be an inspiration and a mentor to many scholars around the world. It's a particular pleasure to have the honour of discussing his lecture given its timely and pressing themes. Martti's lecture addresses the question of backlash against global governance and its relationship to international law. Many of us share the sense that the myriad high-profile instances of leaving, denouncing, withdrawing, and unsigning are somehow related to the increasingly vocal backlash to global governance expressed by populist movements from both the left and the right. Yet trying to make sense of the relations between backlash to global rule, populist politics, the rise of authoritarian leaders, and specific international legal arrangements is not straightforward. Martti framed his intervention in the language of enlightenment and disenchantment. This is language made familiar through the sociology of Max Weber and in the legal thinking of Scandinavian and American legal realists. What those traditions share is a Protestant heritage. Felix Cohen once described American realism as an assault upon all dogmas, a mode of thinking that was, Cohen pointed out, naturally of special prominence in a Protestant movement. Like many Protestant movements, these forms of critique insist that we should not trust metaphysical or magical thinking, or place our faith in false icons or empty rituals. We should not think in terms of abstractions and become enchanted by our tools, but instead relentlessly subject our faith, our institutions, and our practices to critique. This is a tradition of permanent revolution. Liberalism, and particularly liberal internationalism, is one site for the unfolding of this revolutionary tradition in the modern world. Liberalism believes in the right and indeed the duty of every person to exercise their liberty of conscience, is committed to practices of militant iconoclasm and interpretive freedom, and engages in a relentlessly anti-hierarchical and anti-institutional challenge to corruption and false prophets. This powerful and self-conflicted tradition, in the words of James Simpson, is in flight from nothing so energetically as from prior forms of itself. So Martti puts that tradition of Protestant self-critique to work in relation to the field of international law and its responsibility for the current moment of authoritarian populist backlash against global governance. And his lecture addresses that themes in two key regards that I'd like to pick up on. The first is the argument that the backlash is in part due to a wrong turn that the field took in the 1960s and that intensified in the 1990s. So according to Martti, the field took that wrong turn when it moved beyond the traditional form of liberal internationalism that treated nation states as the bearers of autonomy and of self-determination, premised on an extreme formality of sovereign equality. Importantly, that earlier traditional form of liberal internationalism understood itself to be limited. It did not purport to constrain the politics within each state. Deciding upon the nature and limits of government was left to the authority of those who ruled. The wrong turn that Martti argues international law took after the 60s involved moving beyond that horizontal form of liberalism towards a liberalism that sought to focus on the rights of individuals within states. Martti compares here the constraints of Wolfgang Friedman writing in 1964 with the expansionist view of Thomas Frank writing in 1999. And Martti notes that Friedman had been careful to assume that human rights could not advance far globally, but by the time Frank came to write his manifesto for a new world, the empowered self, this had changed. According to Frank, each individual is entitled to choose an identity reflecting personal preference. Society had no legitimate claim to enforce morals. And this includes, as Martti gestures towards in a footnote referencing the Hart-Devlin debate, the criminalisation of homosexual acts between men in private. So for Martti, this explains the initial enchantment with rights, yet as more and more preferences were translated into rights, activists began to worry, I'm quoting from the lecture, if everything was a right, nothing was, how to separate genuine from fake rights. So in this telling the 1960s inheritance of human rights, the resulting breakup of national cultures and the loosening of social and religious norms was a step too far that has led to the backlash and to the emergence of wars conducted in the name of culture. These culture wars now threaten the institutions of global governance. So I agree with Martti's analysis that the populist moment is a symptom of the limits of liberalism as pursued on a global scale. However, I disagree with his diagnosis of which aspects of the liberal project have fueled that backlash, with his interpretation of the limits to the liberal project being cultural rather than material, and with his interpretation of what the populist moment represents in relation to those questions. So let me explain. In my reading, international law did not become a vehicle for forms of liberalism directed at protecting the rights of individuals only in the 1960s. If we think about the rights of foreign individuals, international law was a vehicle for protecting those rights and the property of foreign nationals from at least as far back as the Jay Treaty Commissions of 1794. And this aspect of liberal internationalism has been steadily consolidated and extended in the centuries since. The 1960s does represent a turning point here, but the turning point is decolonisation. So during the 60s, foreign investors in their home states began to perceive that decolonisation posed a potential threat to the security and profitability of investments in newly independent states and sought to introduce greater protections for investments in private property. So that's very familiar to all of us here. It was in the 60s that the key procedural step was taken by the World Bank with the negotiating of the ICSID Convention, the establishment of a centre for arbitration, and more importantly, the provision that the resulting awards would be recognised and enforceable in the courts of member states. As states entered into a growing number of bilateral investment treaties, we saw substantive provisions interpreted to protect investors against the effects on profits of routine government regulation aimed at, for instance, protecting public health, hello Australia, the environment, or consumer safety. And whereas in the century following the Jay Treaty, international claims processes were directed towards loss suffered during conflict or revolution, in the era of bilateral investment treaties or BITs, the focus of arbitral scrutiny became the everyday conduct of government regulation and its impact on the profits of foreign investors. That regime was consolidated and expanded during the 90s with the negotiation of many new BITs and other broad-reaching agreements, such as the Energy Charter Treaty and the North American Free Trade Agreement. And to give some sense of the reach of this form of adjudication, by the end of 2017, a total of 855 investor-state claims have been brought, of which the majority were brought against developing countries or transitional economies, and the majority brought by developed country investors, with 257 claimants from the US and the Netherlands alone. In cases decided against the state in favour of the investor, the average amount claimed was 1.3 billion and the average amount awarded was 504 million. There is nothing comparable in relation to the enforcement of international human rights treaties, and outside Europe and the inter-American system, the impact of that body of law is minimal. International lawyers, human rights lawyers, could only dream of such influence and effect. And I would argue that it's this aspect of liberal internationalism that has been the subject of the most intense backlash politics. In the field of investment law, both the procedural ICSID Convention and substantive bilateral investment treaties and the Energy Charter Treaty have been challenged. Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela have denounced the ICSID Convention, while numerous states have withdrawn from or announced their intention to terminate some or all of their bids, including Austria, Bolivia, the Czech Republic, Ecuador, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Italy, Poland, Russia, South Africa, and Venezuela. In the area of economic integration, the US has initiated the renegotiation of NAFTA, and the UK signalled its withdrawal from the EU sometime. In addition, the US unsigned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Russia withdrew from provisional application of the Energy Charter Treaty. According to UNCTAD, the investment treaty regime has reached a turning point, with only 18 new investment treaties concluded in 2017, the lowest number since 1983. Perhaps more significantly, for the first time, the number of effective investment treaty terminations in that year was higher than the number of new treaties concluded. So in my view, what happened in the 60s wasn't that liberal lawyers went too far in relation to human rights, but rather that decolonisation placed the question of the material limits to the liberal order squarely on the international agenda. So as I've argued in detail elsewhere, the colonies had long served as one vehicle for dealing with the material conditions of liberalisation. That is, for offering the space perceived as necessary for addressing perceived problems of surplus populations produced by economic liberalisation, and for ensuring access to new sources of resources and markets. And with decolonisation, those material limits began to register for international law both human limits and ecological limits. Climate change has again put these questions on the table. It seems clear that a planet full of people exercising the kinds of liberty imagined for European men in previous eras is not sustainable. So where does that leave us? This then brings me to the second major theme of Martti's lecture, and an analysis of the relation of our current post-truth politics to more fundamental questions about knowledge, facts, and expertise. And I think nowhere is this clearer than in the debate over climate change. And here I'm in furious agreement with the argument Martti develops in his lecture. Attempts to rely upon international politics and lawmaking in their existing forms, the forms that brought us economic globalization, have failed to produce a solution to the problem of climate change. As Dipesh Chakrabarty has argued, the global in global warming means something different from the global in globalization. The globe of global warming involves the Earth as a planet. The globe of globalization involves a web of human relations that have been created in pursuit of power and profit. The problem of global warming has consequences for how we think about the history and future of globalization in the other sense. But the politics of international lawmaking that has brought us both globalization and global warming is not proving capable of addressing the upheavals to which this experiment in revolutionary liberalism is leading us. And we can see this illustrated in the battleground over facts and science in current debates about climate change. Despite, or perhaps because of the weight that has been given to facts as established by science and expertise in public policy, the idea of science as an authoritative form of knowledge is subjected to growing skepticism. The significance of scientific expertise, including that of legal science, is being posed as a political and a democratic question because of the weight that such science is today being asked to bear in policy making. The climate change debate illustrates that well. Political concerns about the viability and justice of a particular political and economic system of resource extraction and distribution have been translated into a highly technical debate about levels and effects of carbon emissions. The effects of the demands that this policy reliance on data places upon scientific method is well illustrated by the resulting attacks on science by climate change deniers. So is the answer to this era of post-truth politics to return to an insistence on truth? And this is, after all, the suggestion we hear repeatedly. Many commentators diagnose the problem today as being that everyone lives in their own bubble. We need to go back to respected sources of news, like the New York Times, or respected sources of intelligence, like the CIA or MI6. Yet, to take just one example, for those of us who've read the Chilcot Inquiry report detailing the forms of intelligence failure involved in the move to the war against Iraq in 2003, this is not a straightforward proposition. Should we really take on trust that the information that is collected, analysed, and made available to the public through the interface between intelligence, political, and media organisations represents the facts, or even more ambitiously, the truth? Was there ever a time or a world in which all people accepted the truth purveyed by powerful officials or influential journalists without question? Is the challenge of the Me Too movement, to mention another populist movement of our era, posed by the fact that women are now allowed to make claims about the conduct of powerful men where once we all believed what the mainstream media told us about them? Or did mainstream audiences, however we imagine them, just not know about those other bubbles of communication within which such stories have always circulated because those stories were not reflected in the broadsheet press or the public sphere? Of course, in an era in which politicians in many countries invoke the concept of fake news, this takes questions of truth, lies, facts, and fiction to another level. And in the face of the flexible approach to the truth that dominates public debate at present, the desire for some authoritative source of knowledge or information can be overwhelming. Yet in this post-truth world, it's not just historians of science, but it's also the communities on Twitter and Facebook who recognise that facts only mean something and are only intelligible within a broader system. And the broader system will shape why facts are produced and how they are used. There is no authority to which we can appeal that will establish that our version of truth or our account of facts is the correct one. There is an inescapable link between what we know and the social conditions underpinning how we have come to know it. This helps to make sense of why people might trust something that is liked by their friends, to use the language of social media, rather than trusting something that they are told is a fact by an expert. What counts as evidence or facts or even truth is an effect of mediating institutions, of particular techniques, and of communities. Which truth we should prefer is then properly a question of politics and of whose authority we trust. And indeed, if we look back to the birth of the experiment as a foundation of scientific practice in Restoration England, we can see that the experimental philosophers of the Enlightenment thought of the laboratory not just as a place where experiments with air pumps could be conducted, but as a place where experiments in social order could be attempted. These experiments took place in a context in which revolutionary evangelical ideals of authenticity, transparency, and visibility sought to distinguish new social orders from corrupt older institutions of church and monarchy. In that climate, the community of experimental philosophers was presented as a model of the ideal polity. This was a community without an arbitrary ruler, inhabiting a public space, involving free men who faithfully testified to the results of their experiments, witnessed in order to produce useful knowledge. The authority of scientific knowledge, in other words, has always been an effect of the political communities and the social relations within and through which it's produced, and not just the techniques of its production. So this recognition that there are contested accounts both of the facts and the values that found the practice of international law is not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. A particular neoliberal model of international law triumphed in the late 20th century. Its displacement poses challenges and opportunities for contemporary critical thinking about the role of law in international politics. International legal systems and the politics they represent must be chosen and defended. The return of history into this story is valuable because it allows us to experience that sense of choice and responsibility anew. Populism has returned as a way of doing politics, a way of doing politics that involves constructing a new subject of collective action, the people, capable of reconfiguring a social order experienced as unjust. But in turn, that populist politics is ideologically empty. There are indeed multiple populisms in play at present. Much will turn on which subjects of collective action are able to gain the sympathy of international experts and of politicians. Which people, as the subjects of populist politics, are able to see their demands treated with serious attention. The question to which this politics gives rise, then, is not whether international law should take account of the populist backlash, but rather which populism will succeed in universalising its demands and what role international lawyers will play in that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Orford, for your very insightful comments. We greatly appreciate them. I now would like to invite the audience to pose questions. Perhaps you can start queuing up. We will have approximately 10 minutes of Q&A, and then President Murphy will deliver closing remarks. When asking a question, we kindly ask that you provide, please, your name and the organization you represent. Are there any questions or comments? There are 2 microphones in the middle aisle. While people are perhaps making their way to the microphones, would either of you like to add or ask each other a question? Yes.
Well, yes, so I would want to address Anne's very excellent point that my understanding of the problem of liberalism differs from hers, and which one of us is correct, how to deal with that. So I suggested that there's a cultural change in the 1960s that created problems. She says, well, it's a much longer period in which economic liberalism has created institutions and patterns of activity, which is responsible for those the problems that we experience. And I would just want to respond to her that I agree with you. There are 2 stories that take place that overlap each other. There's an intellectual story about international law, which is what I've been engaged in since The Gentle Civilizer, which looks at international law from the perspective of an intellectual and cultural and professional creation from the late 19th century, and traces the trajectory of those ideas as ideas. What she does is, I think, more important in the sense that she has a deep look into the economic structures and the political structures of decision making that go way further back, in which international law, in my sense, didn't exist in the late 18th century and continues to rule at this point. And later, I have nothing else apart from make that comment. I don't dispute her claim. I think to finish somewhere, perhaps one could say in a Marxist way that we have an economic foundation and a cultural superstructure, and both of which maybe they don't relate to each other in the way that Marx thought, but they are both there, and that the engagement that's today taking place takes place at both of those levels. And it's a really important strategic, and I suppose also a principled question, which of the levels you take on so as to advance whatever project you have.
Professor Orford, did you want to add anything before we go to the first mic?
No, I think that.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thank you and good evening, and thank you, Professor Koskenniemi and Professor Orford, for your very, very enlightening, very enlightening discussion this evening. I have one quite specific question that bothered me throughout both presentations. You both spoke about global governance on the one hand, and less so globalization. And then I think at one point, Professor Orford, you sort of used both terms interchangeably. So what I would want to understand from both of you is whether you see global governance and globalization as actually one and the same, or whether you understand them as 2 different phenomenon, and how that understanding of both issues relates to the subject of the discussion this evening, the movement from enchantment to disenchantment. Thank you. My name is Ruana Haynes from Climate Analytics. It's a climate policy think tank with offices in Berlin, Lomé, and New York. Thanks.
Thank you. Perfect.
Globalization and global governance are open 2 different vocabularies and 2 ways of professional engagement. So in my imagination, global governance is a series of technical institutions and tools and technical engagements that deal with concrete policy problems as they arise. And that vocabulary and that context opens a field in which many of us operate. Globalization is a sociological description of a process that can be analyzed from well, sociological perspective, maybe also from other perspectives, environmental certainly. It's a more scientific set of questions that does not deal with policy problems as they arise. So that would be the distinction I make between global governance and globalization.
Thank you. Mr. Orford?
So neither of those terms are terms I would use in general play when I'm writing or thinking, but we see the language of globalization often come up as part of a backlash discussion. So anti-globalization activism, or the language of globalist, which has a longer and more disturbing heritage, I think, used to critique forms of transnational solidarity. So I think the language is a language that comes out of international relations, that comes out of sociology, that also comes out of forms of backlash politics. And to the extent I'm trying to engage with those things, I would use that language while I'm speaking. But it's not actually conceptually something that I find very helpful in my own work, where I try to be more precise about the specific relations, institutions, techniques, forms of law that I'm evaluating.
Thank you. Question at the back?
Yes, hello. My name is Elizabeth Wilson, and I'm with the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict and also Rutgers Law School. I have more of a comment that I wanted to put out there to try to bring the two stories that Martti was characterizing the two presentations as, and I think that there's a central point where they kind of come together around the uncertainty about the place of property in the human rights regime. There is an ambivalence and tension around property as a right, which is there in many of the founding texts, and the growing sort of embrace that social and economic rights mean something more than just the protection of property. And certainly Western cultures, the US and Europe, have more staunchly supported a view of property as a right on a par with all other rights. I just wanted to highlight that because, as a human rights lawyer, a little defensive in these days, because I feel that human rights are bearing the brunt of a critique and analysis that I'm not sure that they always deserve. And I really appreciate Professor Orford's counter argument about the importance of neoliberalism in generating the backlash. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything, Martti or Anne? No? Thank you for your comments. Yes, at the back, Mike, and then we'll go to the front.
My name's Nathan Kinsey. I'm from the Australian Attorney General's Department, Office of International Law. I want to go back to the point that was raised to begin with about what has been the trigger for the disenchantment. On the one side, is it a result of aggressive investment litigation in response to decolonisation, or an increase in rights consciousness, which is undermining the old order? But I wonder whether our two speakers could speak a little bit more about the narrative that has arisen from populist movements themselves. And I mean, can we engage with that to try and uncover what the cause is? Or, I mean, Professor Orford, you talked about the difficulties in uncovering truth because of the social context, and so is there something that the narrative of the populist movements can tell us? And I'm interested in that from a public policy perspective, because I'm thinking about, well, what are the responses from government to this crisis? So I wonder whether you could comment on that.
Great question. Let me first insist on the point I made in opening, that there's more than one form of populist movement. So there are multiple forms of populism at the moment. I think it's a populist moment because we don't know which one is going to win. It's an open question. And I mentioned Me Too because the Women's March has been one very strong response to an authoritarian politics emerging around the world. And we could just as easily give some attention to that if we want to think about how people might react to populism. So now I'm going to make a really powerful point that comes from parenting toddlers back in my past. And I can remember we used to be advised at the kindergarten, okay, if one toddler beats up another toddler, the idea is to turn your back on the violent one and give all your attention to the one who's been hurt, because what the violent one wants is all the attention. And if you get rewarded with attention every time you're violent, it just teaches you that's a good idea. So if all the space in discussions about what international lawyers should make of populism goes to the men who want to explain why they should exclude migrants or control women, I think that's a mistake, an analytical and political mistake. So that's one thing I was trying to address. And then if we say, what do different populist movements want, that's one of the reasons I think it's very hard to make a connection in a very straightforward way to forms of policy change, because what people want and how they understand that to be related to an international or transnational institution is far from clear. So James Meek has just published, or is just publishing, a book called Dreams of Leaving and Remaining, a kind of journalistic oral history almost in the UK about what Remainers and Leavers think will happen as a result of remaining or leaving from the EU. And when you listen to that, the policy conclusions are far from clear. So I think what I'm interested in looking at to a degree is how populist energy is being used to justify certain kinds of actions of withdrawing, leaving, unsigning, et cetera, I think that is a very interesting thing to watch. So what exactly is being withdrawn from and denounced and unsigned? How is that being connected to populist movements? And how should we understand that process? I think it's very difficult to do that. I don't think it's straightforward.
Did you want to add anything?
Two short points. So the question was, how should one engage with the populist narrative? So what would be the populist narrative out there with which one would engage? And I agree with Anne that there are many different narratives, so there's not one response to that. But I've been particularly struck by and disappointed by the effort to engage far-right reactionaries by suggesting more reform that would accommodate far-right reactionary positions. I see in international law, at least in Europe, people saying, well, we have to take these people on board, and I don't think that's the way to go. So because of what I explained in the lecture, so they don't participate in reform, because even participating in the debate legitimizes the other part. So my first point is, I don't want to engage those people. My second point is a little bit to disagree with Anne that there are multiple populisms there, and leave it at that, because I think there is a far-right reactionary movement that's really dangerous and bad, and that's the enemy. And then there are other people with whom I'm really happy to engage. And so I find it difficult to put them in the same bag in the way she does.
Okay, so first microphone, and then after the response, and then the last gentleman in the back. I'm afraid that will have to be the last question, and I'll turn it over. So, yes, sir.
I'm Paolo Farah from West Virginia University. I was curious to hear from you, how do you position technology in your analysis, in your lectures? Because technology like artificial intelligence, big data, and algorithm, or even blockchain technologies, they do really having a big impact on human rights, on sustainability, in good and in bad. So I would be happy to hear, how do you position technology in global governance and globalization? Because I do think it's really an important game changer with how it was technology, how it is technology, and how it will be with all these emerging technologies. Thank you.
That's a really big question. And I just have a very short answer. In the talk, I referred to a meeting on ICT technology, or cyber operations and international law, as the meeting was. And two things became pretty obvious in the debates between technical experts on ICT and international lawyers. One was that, well, actually, it's really hard to see what role international law could play, and that those technical questions do not render themselves to translated into international legal things very easily. So that's one thing. The second thing was that there is a very strong push for military people to overtake the debate on the technology and law. So when the thing gets articulated in law, it gets too easily articulated in terms of military technologies and their applications, etc. And that obviously has also a really powerful impact on the substance of the way of the translation is being made. It's a really great question, and I suppose technologies are very different. So if it's a medical technology, for instance, so that's one thing. If it's a cyber technology, it's another thing. But there are powerful interests that immediately tend to take those issues and exploit the military and economic implications that they have.
So I would say that in the story that I told, I would put the development of these technologies, many of which are developed by major leading industrialized liberal states, as part of a story of revolutionary liberalism, really. And that in large part, many of these new technologies and their development has been lightly regulated because of the context in which they are emerging. We are now seeing attempts through global projects to try and figure out ways to think about the implications for questions of order, freedom, security, privacy, to which all these new technologies are giving rise. Those are the same questions that international lawyers have been wrestling with for as long as they've been international lawyers, I think. So it seems to me that they present many of the same issues in a really intensified form.
Thank you. Okay, last question.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Lamb from Queen's University in Canada. I found it telling that both of you ended by talking about climate change. Professor Koskenniemi, you had the last section was entitled Utopia, and you ended with that anecdote of your daughter saying she doesn't want to fly here because of the carbon emissions, which portrays the problem as an issue really of personal choice. And Professor Orford, you spoke first about the distrust of experts in relation to climate change, which is really telling because this is an area where our ability or the ability of experts to win will be decisive potentially for our existence. And then at the very end, you spoke about the opportunity that this new populism provides for new kinds of politics or filling up. What was interesting about that was there was no law in there, right? So there was no law was not. You didn't use law as the answer to climate change. You didn't bring it up. Although, if law fails, if international law fails in helping us deal with climate change, that would be the ultimate disenchantment, arguably. And so my question is, how do the things that you discussed, personal responsibility, personal choices, fight about expertise, the opportunity for this new kind of politics, how does that interact with law in confronting this challenge in your view?
Well, so it's very perceptive of you to point out that in our finishing sections, we didn't really talk about law. We talked about other things. Part of my argument was that the enchantment with law is a tragic situation, because law as a tool should lead you to something more worthy of enchantment. And when it's only law, when you have nothing else to say about, well, did you follow the rules, then that's a problem. So at least I wanted to try to begin a discussion of what it is if we think of laws as tools, and we are here practitioners and professionals, and we use these. What do we use these for? And acknowledging that the articulation of that is tremendously difficult, that there are many false prophets out there that offer us things to which law could point. So I wanted to suggest that nevertheless, although it's immensely difficult, it could also be really easy. But if it's really easy, this means it has to start from a really personal perspective. World is full of prophets, has been full of prophets who sketch these utopias far away out there and give wonderful literary expression to something that has no relationship to the lives of human beings in the present. So that would be a utopia as a kind of a smokescreen. So obviously, being political in the small has always been a problematic position, but equally obviously building a fantastic utopian city in one's imagination is at least equally difficult. It's a really hard thing to negotiate the distance between what I as a professional can and should do and what should be that larger image. But being like Anne, a person who's much involved with our children, so more and more when I try to think of what international law could then be for, more and more I think that the only realistic way in which I can answer this is that to help their lives and to help them lead their children forward to something better. It's not up for me to say, to have that ready sketched castle to give to them. It's the little things that that we can give so that they can build whatever it is. We've, in a sense, climate change is such a manifestation of a massive failure of modernity. But as we know, we don't suffer that failure. It's they who suffer.
So I think that where there is politics, there is law. But if that politics changes radically, which it may have to address the coming crises, which will be ecological, but which will flow from that to be all sorts of other things, then law too may need to take another form. So the form of law that brought us here may not be the form of law that takes us from here, because it seems not to be able somehow to deal with this situation, partly because I think we imagined that this state system and its relationship to forms of corporate decision-making would persist forever, that this was interminable. Now, not only can we imagine that the state system might end, but in fact, we find it, as Jamison says, easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So therefore, if we can't think our way out of this through the systems that we have, the systems will be changed. I mean, I think that is what is coming. And how they will be changed could be really very troubling if the way we deal with this is to put up more borders so that people who are fleeing the consequences of climate-induced disruption have to stay somewhere else. That's the nightmare scenario. So I think that's why I'm saying that we need a form of law that can match a different populist politics that isn't that politics.
So when the executive director of the American Society last summer said to me that I needed to think about who might be a good Grotius lecturer, and when I asked Mark Agrast, well, what are the qualities we're looking for in the Grotius lecturer, he said things like, well, a very high level of intellectual engagement, someone who will challenge the society to think and rethink some of our core perceptions, someone who will take our theme perhaps and talk about it a bit and weave it into the lecture, someone who's familiar with history, theory, and someone who's an animated speaker. And there was one name that popped into my mind immediately, and that was Martti Koskenniemi. So thank you, Martti, very much for delivering an exceptional lecture that met and surpassed the bar that we try to set for the Grotius lecture. Anne Orford was also selected to be the discussant because we knew that she would be someone who would probe Martti's ideas, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing. And that's the way that we like the discussant to approach the matter. So thank you for wonderful remarks. If I can just say collectively what I take away at a very high level here is that we should all be approaching this idea of international law as an instrument or as a tool with open eyes as to what those tools are and what they are not, what they can do for us and what we should not expect them to be able to do for us. And perhaps that's the way to avoid the enchantment that perhaps will inevitably lead to the disenchantment. I like the way Anne somewhat left her final remarks. Maybe it's time for a new chapter of critical legal thinking as we move forward. Thank you both very much for your remarks. Thank you to Dean Nelson for moderating the session. We're very grateful again to the American University Washington College of Law for supporting the lecture. We invite you to join us for the Grotius reception, which will immediately follow this event. If you go through the registration lobby area right outside the exhibit space, cross over to the International Terrace West, that's where you'll find the reception. It's being sponsored by American University Washington College of Law and also by Hal Shapiro, partner at the law firm of Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. Thank you all very much for coming, and please join me in a warm round of thanks for our speakers.